Before I start, here's a little preview. You won't believe what happened when my son's old college roommate reached out to me after all these years. His words, they felt so true, so unexpected. They stirred something in me I hadn't realized was still there. Stay with me till the end. You'll understand what I mean. But first, tell me, from which city are you watching us today? I love knowing where everyone is tuning in from. And please, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps more than you know. Now, let's begin. It started with a simple email on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that smelled faintly of coffee and rain, where the house felt too big and the silence too heavy. My son Matt had moved out almost 8 years ago. The guest room had long ago become a place where I stored old books, folded laundry, and kept the window half open so the curtains fluttered just a little, reminding me that the world outside still moved. The email subject said, "Hello, Mrs. Carter." It's been a long time. I almost didn't open it. It felt like spam at first, until I noticed the name below. Even Honor. I froze for a second. Even Richards, Matt's old college roommate, the boy who had filled our home with laughter one summer when the boys stayed here during break. He was polite, thoughtful, always helping with dishes, always asking me if I needed anything from the store. I remembered his voice, calm, deep, with that faint, careful tone of someone raised to listen before speaking. The email was short, just a few lines. "Hi, Mrs. Carter. I don't know if you remember me, but I was Matt's roommate back at State. I found your email through an old contact list. I hope you're well. I've thought often about those summers and your kindness to us. I'd love to catch up if you're open to it." I must have read it 3 times before I replied. "Yes, of course I remember you, Evan. I hope you're doing well. Catching up sounds lovely. Tell me what you've been up to." That's how it began. At first, our exchanges were simple, short notes about where life had taken us. He lived 2 states away now, in a small town near Asheville. Worked remotely as a designer, spent weekends hiking, lived alone with a golden retriever named Bailey. His words had an honesty to them that I found strangely comforting. He didn't embellish or try to sound impressive. He wrote like he spoke back then, steady, measured, warm. And I suppose, after so many years of being on my own, I hadn't realized how much I missed being spoken to like that. We started exchanging emails every few days, then messages. He'd send me photos of sunsets over the Blue Ridge, the way the sky seemed to melt into gold. I'd sent him pictures of my garden, the roses, the weathered bench where I drank tea in the evenings. Our conversations deepened quietly. He told me about losing his mother a few years back and how hard it had been to let go of the house she'd loved. I shared how the silence in mine sometimes felt like an echo of who I used to be, before Matt left, before my husband and I separated. There was no rush, no pretense, just 2 people remembering how to talk. One day he wrote, "I drove past that little bakery you used to love. They still make those lemon bars you used to bring us when we studied late. I thought of you." I smiled at that, sitting at my kitchen table, the light slanting through the blinds. That bakery had closed years ago, but somehow I could still taste the sweetness, the powdered sugar on my fingers. A few days later he called. His voice sounded older, steadier, but there was something in it that made the years fold in on themselves. We talked for an hour that first night, then again the next. He never said anything out of place, just warmth, curiosity, and something unspoken that lingered between the words. At some point, he said quietly, "I always admired how peaceful your home felt. Even when we were just kids trying to figure out who we were, you made it feel safe." I didn't know what to say. It's strange how you can live a whole life inside the same walls and forget how they once held laughter, voices, music. Hearing that from him, It made me realize something had been sleeping inside me. Something gentle, not dramatic, just quietly alive. That night, I sat by the window and looked out at the streetlights glowing on the wet pavement. I thought of all the conversations that fade over time, and how rare it is when one returns years later and feels exactly right. When I told Matt about Avon's message the next day, he was surprised but pleased. "Avon's a good guy, Mom," he said. "I'm glad you two reconnected." I didn't tell him how much those emails had started to mean to me. Some feelings don't need defining. They just need space to breathe. Weeks went by. Our talks became a rhythm, the soft, reliable kind. He'd ask how the roses were doing. I'd ask how Bailey's morning walks were. Sometimes when I'd tell him a story from years ago, he'd remember small details I'd long forgotten, like the old record player in the living room or the blue teacups I used to bring out when the boys were home. It felt nice, familiar yet new. Then one evening he asked if I'd ever thought of visiting the mountains again. I hesitated before replying, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Not recently," I wrote, "but I do miss that kind of quiet." "Maybe you should," he said. "You always seemed happiest in places that breathe." That line stayed with me for days. Maybe it was the way he remembered things I'd never thought anyone noticed. Maybe it was because his words didn't sound like an invitation, just an observation, one that felt like it saw right through the noise of my life. When I turned off the lights that night, I realized something had shifted, quietly, like the air before rain. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep smiling. It was mid-September when Avon suggested we meet. The leaves had only just started to blush at their edges, and the air carried that gentle coolness that hints at change. I had spent the morning in the garden, trimming back the late roses, when his message came through. He wrote, "I'll be in your area next weekend, visiting an old friend. Would you like to have coffee?" I read it slowly, twice, maybe 3 times. Coffee. Just coffee. Simple. Harmless. And yet my heart gave a small, unmistakable flutter, one that startled me with its sincerity. It had been years since I'd felt anticipation like that. I answered after a moment, "That would be lovely, Evan. There's a quiet little cafe near the lake that I think you'd like." He replied almost immediately, "You choose the time. I'll be there." That week passed in a strange kind of quiet excitement. I found myself noticing things again, the way the afternoon light turned the kitchen golden, how the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery made me pause on my walks. I even brought out a scarf I hadn't worn in years, soft and blue like the sky before evening. Saturday came. The cafe by the lake was small, with wooden chairs and big windows that let you see the rippling water just beyond the trees. I arrived a few minutes early, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, trying to steady the slight tremor in my chest. Then he walked in. It's funny how memory can freeze a person in time, but there he was, older of course, broader in the shoulders, his hair touched with gray at the edges. Yet his eyes, kind and steady, were exactly as I remembered them. He smiled when he saw me, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, "it's really good to see you." "Please," I laughed. "It's Anne. I think you've earned that by now." We sat by the window, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was no awkwardness, just the quiet recognition that years had passed, and yet something familiar remained between us. He told me about his work, the trails he'd hiked, the friends he'd made. I told him about the community center where I volunteered, and how I'd started painting again, just small things. The conversation flowed easily, like 2 old songs blending into one another. At one point, he leaned back and said, "You haven't changed much. You still have that same calm about you. It's rare." I smiled but didn't answer. I wasn't sure what to say to that. I didn't feel calm most days, but in that moment, sitting across from him, I suppose I did. After coffee, we walked by the lake. The breeze carried a soft chill, and the water shimmered under the afternoon sun. He told me about his mother again, how she used to sit outside with a cup of tea every morning, just listening to the world wake up. "I think she would have liked you," he said. "You remind me of her in some ways." That touched me more than I expected. We walked slowly, our steps matching without trying. There wasn't any need to fill the silence. Sometimes the pauses between words said more than anything else could. When we reached the bench near the water's edge, we sat. I could feel the warmth of the sun through my jacket, and for a while we just watched the ripples move outward, one circle after another, fading gently into the distance. Evan turned to me then and said, "You know, when I wrote that first email, I didn't expect much. I just wanted to say thank you. But it's strange how right this feels, talking to you again." I met his gaze, and there it was, that same quiet truth I had felt in his words. "Maybe some things find their way back when they're meant to," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe they do." We talked until the sky softened into that pale pink hue that only comes in early autumn. When we finally stood, there was a calm between us, something unspoken but understood. At the car, he paused before leaving. "I'm glad I reached out," he said. "So am I," I replied. He smiled again, that same boyish, steady smile, and then he was gone, walking toward his car, the wind tugging gently at his jacket. That night, the house felt different. Not empty, just quieter in a way that felt peaceful instead of lonely. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The moon was rising, full and gentle, like a promise of something still unfolding. I didn't know what any of it meant yet. I didn't want to rush it or name it. All I knew was that a part of me that had been asleep for years had quietly opened its eyes. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for life to begin again. I felt like I was already living it. After that afternoon by the lake, Evan and I stayed in touch more often. It wasn't planned. It just happened naturally, the way good conversations often do. A message here, a call there, a photo he'd send of the mountain sunrise, or a recipe he'd tried that reminded him of something I used to cook. It became a gentle rhythm, one that wove itself into my days. There were still long stretches of quiet, moments when I'd be folding laundry or watering the garden and suddenly think of something he'd said, and I'd smile without realizing it. The small, unexpected comfort of being remembered had settled into me like a warm light that didn't need to be explained. One evening in late October, he called again. His voice sounded a little wary, softer than usual. "Long day?" I asked. He chuckled lightly. "One of those weeks where every plan seems to fall apart, but talking to you makes it feel less heavy." I felt a warmth spread through me at that, not the kind that flutters, but the kind that steadies you. "Well, I'm glad I can help, even if it's just by listening," I said. We talked for almost 2 hours that night about everything and nothing. Books, places we'd like to see, how the world feels different when you're older and learn to notice the quieter things. Before we hung up, he said, "I'm thinking of driving up again next month. Would that be all right?" "Yes," I said simply. "That would be nice." The weeks leading up to that visit passed gently. Life went on in its ordinary ways. Grocery lists, morning walks, my volunteering days at the center. But there was a quiet anticipation that colored everything around me. I even found myself humming again while making breakfast, something I hadn't done in years. When he arrived the second time, it was late afternoon. The sky was that deep orange that comes right before dusk, and the air smelled faintly of pine and chimney smoke. I opened the door to find him holding a small box. "Just a little something," he said. Inside was a simple wooden ornament, a hand-carved bird, wings spread wide. "It reminded me of freedom," he said. "And of you." I didn't know what to say at first. It was such a small, thoughtful thing, but something in it touched me deeply. We spent that evening on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot cider. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of dry leaves. We didn't speak much. There was a comfort in the silence, the kind you share only with someone who feels familiar, even after years apart. He told me stories about his younger days. Mistakes, lessons, little victories. I shared mine too, not as confessions, but as memories. There was no judgment between us, just understanding. Two people who had lived enough life to know that time softens things, and that sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that teach us how to listen. At one point, he said quietly, "You know, I think people underestimate second chances. Not the kind that rewrite the past, but the kind that make you see the present more clearly." I nodded. I think that's what this feels like, clarity. Like finding color in a place you thought was gray. He looked at me for a moment, not with intensity, but with quiet sincerity. "Exactly," he said. It was then that I realized how natural it felt having him there, how his presence didn't fill the empty spaces in my life, but made them gentler, easier to live in. When he left the next morning, he stood by the car and said, "I'll call when I get home. Maybe next time you can come down my way. I'd like to show you the trails I always talk about." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. After he drove off, I stayed on the porch for a while, watching the road curve out of sight. The world felt wider somehow, not because of him alone, but because he reminded me that life still had chapters left to be written. That evening, I took the small wooden bird and placed it by the window. The way the morning light would catch on its wings the next day, that became something to look forward to. Over the next few weeks, our calls continued. Sometimes short, sometimes long. Sometimes we didn't talk for days, and that was fine too. It wasn't about needing constant contact. It was about knowing there was someone out there who understood the rhythm of your silence. One night, while sitting by the fire, I realized how much my world had changed, not dramatically, but quietly, like the slow turn of seasons. I had gone from feeling like life was something behind me to realizing it was still unfolding, patiently, waiting for me to notice. And though I didn't know what would happen next, I knew this much. I was ready to see where the path might lead, not because I was searching for anything, but because I had finally remembered how it felt to walk forward with an open heart. It was early winter when I finally decided to visit Evan. The first snow had fallen a few days earlier, dusting the roads in pale white. The air had that crisp bite that wakes you up and makes everything feel new again. He had called the week before, his voice warmed through the phone. "No pressure," he said, "but if you ever want to see these mountains I keep talking about, they'd love to meet you." I laughed at the way he said it, as if the mountains themselves were old friends. And maybe in some quiet way I felt ready to see what his world looked like, ready to let mine expand a little further. The drive was long, winding through small towns and open fields. With each mile, the noise in my head, the lists, the what-ifs, the careful hesitations, grew quieter. I found myself just watching the sky, watching the horizon shift from gray to gold. When I arrived, his home was exactly what I had pictured. A small cabin tucked against a line of trees, smoke rising softly from the chimney, the faint sound of a dog barking in the distance. Bailey came bounding toward me first, tail wagging furiously, as if greeting someone already known. Then Evan stepped out onto the porch. "You made it," he said, smiling. "I did," I said, and suddenly the long drive, the cold air, all of it felt worth it. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon. A fire crackled in the hearth, and there were books stacked everywhere, on shelves, on tables, even near the windowsill. It was the kind of space that felt lived in, honest, warm. He poured me a cup of tea and said, "You have no idea how good it is to see you here." We spent that afternoon walking a trail that wound up behind his home. The snow was light underfoot, soft enough that it barely made a sound. The trees were bare but beautiful, their branches drawn like quiet lines against the sky. Every so often, he'd point out a place where he'd sat to sketch or think, and I'd listen, imagining the version of him that lived here, the one who'd built a quiet life out of solitude and patience. At one point, he stopped, turned toward me, and said, "When I reached out that day, I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I needed to reconnect with something that once felt true." His words carried through the cold air like something fragile and real. I felt them settle deep inside. "I think," I said, "we both found something we didn't know we were missing." He smiled, that same steady smile I'd come to know, and for a moment the world seemed still, as if even the wind had paused to listen. Back at the cabin, as dusk began to fall, we sat by the fire. The flames flickered and danced across the walls, casting shadows that moved like memories. He played soft music in the background, an old tune, something with a slow rhythm and gentle chords. We talked about the years that had shaped us, the things we'd lost, and the things we'd quietly learned to carry. It wasn't a conversation about regret or longing. It was about acceptance, the understanding that not every connection is meant to be rushed or defined. Some are simply meant to be felt. Avon looked into the fire and said softly, "You know, Anne, people spend so much of their lives trying to find big moments. But I think the real ones are small, like this. Just two people sitting quietly, knowing they're understood." I nodded, watching the light from the fire dance across his face. "You're right," I said. "Sometimes peace looks like this." That night, as I lay in the small guest room, I listened to the sound of the wind brushing gently against the windows. There was a stillness to it, not the silence of loneliness, but the calm that comes when you've finally stopped running from your own thoughts. In the morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, spilling golden light across the wooden floor. I heard him moving in the kitchen, the clink of cups, the low hum of the radio. It felt like the world had slowed just enough for me to catch up with it. When I stepped outside later, the mountains stretched out endlessly before me. The air was sharp and clean, and I thought about how far I'd come, not just in distance, but in heart. Ivan joined me on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He handed me one and said, "You know, when I was younger, I used to think happiness was something you chased. Lately, I think it's something you make room for." I smiled, looking out at the horizon. Maybe that's what we've both been doing, making room. He nodded, and for a long moment, we just stood there, side by side, watching the morning light stretch over the hills. There was no need for grand words or promises. What we shared didn't need definition. It was enough that it was real, steady, kind, and honest. When it was time to leave later that day, I felt no sadness, only gratitude. Because sometimes the most unexpected connections remind us that life still holds beauty, not just in what's ahead, but in the simple, quiet truth of being seen and understood. As I drove home, the road ahead glowed with late afternoon light. The world looked different, though it hadn't changed. Maybe I had. And when I reached my house that evening, I walked straight to the window where the little wooden bird sat. The sunset caught its wings just right, and for a moment it seemed to shine. That was when I realized some words don't need to be spoken to feel true. Some moments don't need to last forever to matter. They just need to happen. And when they do, you carry them with you, quietly, deeply, always.